8 shots rang out inside the crowded Lübeck courtroom. 30-year-old Marianne Bachmeier, but she was not waiting for the judge to deliver a sentence. On March 6, 1981, the trial of Klaus Grabowski became the site of a public execution. This act of retributive justice remains a controversial chapter in legal history. The air in the Landgericht, or district court, was thick with the clinical smells of old paper and floor wax. Judge Günther Kroger presided over what should have been a standard morning session. Klaus Grabowski, a 35-year-old butcher and convicted sex offender, sat with his back to the gallery, seemingly indifferent to the weight of the charges against him. He had admitted to taking the life of a 7-year-old girl, but his defense was a calculated insult to the grieving family. He claimed the child had tried to blackmail him. Marianne Bachmeier, the mother of that child, sat just a few feet away. She was a woman known in the Lübeck nightlife for her strength and her struggles, but today she was silent. Witnesses later recalled how she stepped behind. From her purse, she produced a Beretta M1934 semi-automatic pistol. Before the bailiffs could react, she pulled the trigger 8 times. 7 bullets tore into Grabowski's back, 6 of them striking vital organs. He died almost instantly on the courtroom floor, the wooden benches peppered with lead. Marianne did not run. She did not scream. She simply waited for the state to realize. The road to that violent morning in March 1981 began nearly a year earlier, on May 5, 1980. In the historic winding streets of Lübeck, West Germany, 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier was the light of her mother's life. Marianne, a 30-year-old restaurant owner, had built a hard-won stability for herself and her daughter. On that Monday morning, Anna stayed home from school. A small deviation. By mid-morning, the child had vanished. She had been abducted by Klaus Grabowski, a 35-year-old local butcher who resided in the same neighborhood. As the hours passed, Marianne's initial concern spiraled into a frantic, desperate search through the city's parks and residential blocks. The police were notified, but the search ended in the most devastating way possible on May 6, 1980. Grabowski's own fiancée provided the tip that led to his swift arrest, unable to reconcile her partner's behavior with the darkness that had surfaced. Following his initial confession, investigators were led to a canal bank on the outskirts of the city. There, hidden among the brush, they discovered a discarded cardboard box. Inside was the lifeless body of little Anna. The city of Lübeck, known for its peaceful atmosphere, was such. As the investigation into Anna's murder deepened, the profile of Klaus Grabowski began to emerge, revealing he was a recidivist sex offender, an individual who had already been convicted of sexual assault against 2 other young girls years prior. But there was one detail that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. The public began to ask how a man with Grabowski's demonstrated capacity for predatory violence was allowed to live within reach of a schoolyard. For Marianne Bachmeier, the grief of losing her only child was compounded by the growing realization that the legal system intended to protect her daughter had failed long before the first hand was laid upon her. It was this failure that would eventually lead a grieving mother to carry a Beretta M1934 into a court of law. Klaus Grabowski was not a man who had simply slipped through the cracks of the West German justice system. He was a man the system had tried and failed to reprogram. At 35 years old, the Lübeck butcher already carried a heavy criminal ledger. He was a recidivist sex offender with a history that chilled the local community to its core. Years prior to the encounter with the atmosphere inside the Lübeck District Court on November 2, 1982, was thick with a tension that reached far beyond the city limits of West Germany. Marianne Bachmeier, the woman the tabloids had dubbed the Revenge Mother, now sat in the defendant's dock, facing the very system she had bypassed 20 months earlier. The case had become a national obsession, sparking a fierce debate over the fragility of the Rechtsstaat, or the rule of law. On one side stood those who saw her as a tragic figure driven to a desperate act by a failing legal system. On the other, were those who feared her actions, invited a return. Prosecutor Per Ulrich Diehl was tasked with a difficult objective, proving that the shooting of Klaus Grabowski was not an impulsive act of passion, but a premeditated execution. The details were chillingly precise. Marianne had acquired the .32 caliber Beretta M1934 pistol months in advance through contacts in the Lübeck nightlife scene. She had concealed the weapon in her handbag, waiting for the opportune moment. When that moment arrived on the third day of Grabowski's trial, she didn't just fire a single warning shot. She emptied the magazine, letting loose 8 bullets into the back of her daughter's killer. The prosecution argued that this level of determination. They pushed back against the narrative of a woman lost in a temporary state of insanity, suggesting instead that she had methodically planned to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. As the trial progressed, the defense countered with a harrowing portrait of Marianne's internal world. They spoke of the deep, singular bond she shared with 7-year-old Anna, the only child she had not given up for adoption. They detailed the psychological toll of hearing Grabowski, a known sex offender, smear the reputation of her dead child in open court by claiming this, they argued, created a state of affect, an overwhelming emotional storm that left her unable to control her impulses. The controversy intensified when it was revealed that the magazine Stern had paid 250,000 Deutsche Marks for her story, leading some to wonder if the tragedy was being exploited for profit. Every witness, from police officers to psychiatrists, was scrutinized under the intense glare of the world's media. But as the legal teams finished their closing arguments, the question remained: would the court see a cold-blooded killer or a grieving mother? The atmosphere inside the Lübeck District Court on the final day of the proceedings was thick with an anticipation that felt almost suffocating. For months, the people of West Germany had been locked in a fierce debate over whether Marianne Bachmeier was a cold-blooded killer, or lead prosecutor Per Ulrich Diehl had maintained a strict legalistic view, arguing that the 8 shots fired into Klaus Grabowski's back were a calculated execution that bypassed the very foundations of the state. He sought a murder conviction, emphasizing that the courtroom should be a place. On the other side of the aisle, the defense painted a picture of a woman who had been hollowed out by grief, acting in a state of deep psychological distress. They pointed to the fact that the legal system had seemingly protected a repeat offender, leaving a grieving mother to witness his attempts to blame herself. But the most devastating revelation was still to come as the world watched as Judge Gunther Kroger finally delivered the verdict on March 2nd, 1983. In a decision that attempted to balance the letter of the law with the human tragedy at its core, the court found Marianne Bachmeier guilty of manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm. The judge acknowledged the immense psychological pressure she was under, yet he could not ignore the premeditated nature of bringing a Beretta semi-automatic pistol into a house of justice. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. It was a moment of profound silence in the chamber. The woman the media called the revenge mother had. Marianne's time behind bars was shorter than many expected, as she was released early in June 1985 after serving roughly half of her sentence. She stepped out into a life that was forever altered, becoming a figure of both sympathy and scrutiny. The 250,000 Deutsche Marks she received from the magazine Stern to cover her legal fees had sparked its own controversy, leading many to question if she had been exploited or supported by the media she once sought to avoid. She lived a quiet life in her remaining years, eventually returning to the city that defined her story. On September 17, 1996, at the age of 46, Marianne passed away from pancreatic cancer in a Lübeck hospital. According to her final wish, she was buried in the Bergtor Cemetery, where she finally found the peace she sought, resting in a grave directly beside her beloved daughter, Anna. Was Marianne Bachmeier a vigilante who did what the state failed to do? Or did her shots in that courtroom? Can a parent ever truly be expected to remain silent when? If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe and drop your theory in the comments below.